Now, at one point, I had footage of the entire event that I'm about to explain to you. My sister and I used to be YouTubers. We had a shared channel which we called Explorin' and Tourin', which was pretty much a giant log for all the places we'd camp at. It was great fun, and my sister and I were practically raised outdoors, so it was pretty natural for us. We started out touring national parks and campsites across America, then we broadened our horizons and did the same thing internationally. We had a pretty good following, and some sponsors from the travel industry, but we stopped filming and creating content after our experience in Romania. It was set to be perfect. A big camping corporation sponsored the entire trip and made all the arrangements for us. All we had to do was film our camping experience in the Carpathian mountains for a few days. And so we packed up immediately and got on the next available flight after we'd been offered the job. The party that met us were gracious hosts and let us stay in their home with them for the night before we were set out into the woods. And the locals told us the legendary stories of the Transylvania area, which led to the popular stories of Dracula, discussed how the woods were home to things that had been feared for centuries. And this gave my sister and I a bit of a thrill to the usual routine of our filming. And we even decided to add our newly gained knowledge to the video to make it more interesting. And we set out early with the rising sun. And that way we could hike a good distance in before we set up camp for the night. And it didn't take me long to start getting a strange feeling, as if being watched. It almost felt like we were walking on a heavily populated trail, but there was no one else hiking in either direction. Now, the mountains themselves were gorgeous, but it still had just an unusual atmosphere to it. And it makes sense that the local Romanians had a fear of these woods for generations, just because of the vibe they put off. And each glance up at the sun's position began to fill me with a little more paranoia, since the feeling of being watched wouldn't go away. And as the sun neared the horizon, we found a great spot which overlooked a small valley and was fairly bare of shrubbery. We got amazing photos and clips from there, the sun setting and the geography of the land. Still though, I couldn't get into the usual rhythm of things, because I couldn't shake that feeling. Somehow, I felt like I could relate to a deer being stalked by hunters. As crazy as that sounds. But I was pretty paranoid. Anyway, after camp was set up and my sister went about making us dinner, I made a big perimeter sweep to see if I could find anything or anyone, just so I could ease myself of this watchful feeling. Though I almost walked through a spiderweb, I didn't find anything unusual, so I returned to camp just as nighttime set in, and I ate my meal in silence. Now, I had been asking my sister the entire time if she was getting the same feeling, and she had. She said that she felt a little off, as if they had an uninvited guest in their home. And so, as an extra precaution, I set up a makeshift tripwire around our tents that would create enough noise to wake us up in case anyone walked up to our camp. So nothing happened that night other than me not sleeping very much. Every breath of the wind or rustle of the leaves made me peek outside my tent window. And in the morning, we decided to pack up and move further into the mountain range, even though my nerves already felt like I'd been out camping for a week. My sister said that she felt fine after a good night's sleep, and that was the reason I still felt the clinging atmosphere, because I just didn't sleep very well. She even made some jabs at me about it while we were filming for the channel. The second night, our camping spot wasn't nearly as good as the first. It felt a little wet, even though we hadn't experienced any rain, and it was tucked in to a cluster of trees. We had a satellite radio and listened to the weather forecast for our area. It said a lot of rain was coming. And that night, the wind picked up right as we started making our campsite, which made it a little more difficult to set up the tents. My sister seemed to enjoy it, the sense of adventure. And I typically would have enjoyed it, but my stress level was through the roof. All I really wanted to do was pack up everything and go back into the town. My sister told me not to worry about it and buried herself warmly in her tent while I stayed in mine listening to the coming storm. And even though the wind caused a lot of the sounds I heard, it seemed that there was something else causing noise, something climbing the trees. I tried to brush it off as the wildlife, but once again, I went most of the night not sleeping much, and when I groggily woke the next day, it was still storming. So we decided to just stay hunkered down to wait it out. It was incredibly boring, and all I could think about was leaving that cursed forest. I made the most of the day, but then my exhaustion overtook me, and I slept through the sound of the pelting rain. I remember waking to my sister shouting and that persistent scratching of the trees. It still rained, but I ignored it once I opened my tent and saw my sister's tent with a giant tear from top to bottom. She was inside of it, screaming. I glanced around to see if I could see the cause of the scratching, but I couldn't see anything. So I jumped to my sister's aid. She was okay, but she told me that she'd been woken by the tear. And, well, it looked similar to what a bear could do to a tent. And so I used the flare in hopes that it would scare off any wildlife, and sort of hoped that a person would see it, so I wouldn't feel so alone in the mountain range. And so the next morning finally came, and with it the sun, and my sister decided to use her scary experience as a way to draw attention to our new video. I wasn't comfortable with it as she recorded our campsite in her torn tent, and I suggested that maybe it was a low-hanging tree, because she hadn't heard the tree scratching noises like I did, and I also didn't want her to feel uncomfortable. Even though that was the most beautiful day of our trip, at that point, it was the worst I'd felt. The feeling of watchful eyes evolved into something more like, the feeling you get when someone hovers right over your shoulder and just out of your vision. I never pointed it to my sister because I wanted to see if she would catch them. But I could hear the scratching faintly in the distance. We took a long lunch as I looked over the map of the area and compared it to our GPS. It would take us a day and a half if we wanted to leave. But my sister pointed out that some castle ruins were nearby, as was indicated on our map. I didn't want to go, but didn't object, as it wasn't too far off. We reached the castle at nighttime and set up camp next to it. My nerves at this point were fried, and I told my sister that I wasn't feeling comfortable anymore, and I just wanted to go home. And now she played it off as exhaustion, and went to film the ruins in the darkness. And I thought to stay behind, but I could hear the scratches right behind me. And so I grabbed the flashlight and ran right after her. Now the ruins were cool, that I can definitely admit, but it was hard to enjoy them. And as we were walking into the castle ruins, I flashed my light into a dark corridor, and I heard some scratching. But this time, it was scratching on stone. Now from there, I must admit, I panicked. Just an overwhelming sense of dread had overcome me, and I convinced my sister to return to the camp. She was convinced that I was just suffering from a panic attack and tried to calm me down, but I started packing everything up into our bags. She told me that we wouldn't get paid from our sponsors if we didn't get the film, but I told her, let's just leave. Her mind changed quickly when she was lifted into the air along the tree for a moment, and something bit into her arm. She fell and we grabbed what we had packed and ran off, and that's where I forgot about the camera and I left it behind. And the scratching noise followed us as we ran back. My sister's arm bore the bite mark, which looked like a snake's bite, so I began to fear that she may have some poison running through her system, after running for several hours, still chased closely by the scratching. But now, my sister clearly recognized the scratching. Said she'd heard it a few times, but assumed it was a woodland creature. And now we ran through the night, walked into the day, and we kept going into the night again, until we reached a small hilltop and an almost medieval-looking village below. The hours of running left us dehydrated and just overexhausted, but the scratching hadn't faded, and neither of us felt safe. So, we continued, but at a much, much slower pace. We approached the edge of the forest and could see the village lights, but the scratching neared, and I feared we wouldn't leave the shadows of the forest. We got closer, and suddenly, the scratching exploded to encompass all directions. Whatever had been following us was more than just one thing. We broke out of the forest and ran through a field towards an ancient church. I glanced over my shoulders and saw 2 red eyes glaring back at me. And then I saw a quick flash of fangs as a pale white human head vanished into the forest. We made it into the church and I finally felt safe for the first time in days. I'm not religious, but that was a hugely profound experience. And I see why the people of Romania have such churches dotted throughout the land. I can't say clearly what my sister and I saw in the forests of the Carpathian mountains, though. Maybe some of that infamous folklore isn't necessarily folklore. We haven't filmed since, nor have we really left the city or America since the experience. And I don't know if we'll ever find out anything more about it. But the story is a warning. Be careful which forests you hike into. Sometimes they hide things that we shouldn't be exposed to.